The bank wanted their land. The town mechanics laughed at the rusted lime-green carcass rotting in the yard. But when the deadliest blizzard in a century buried Ohio under 20 feet of snow, the junkyard Steiger wasn't just a joke anymore. It was a 20-ton lifeline. The November wind, sweeping across the flatlands of Mercer County, Ohio, carried the bitter promise of an early winter. It whipped through the bare branches of the oak trees lining the Pendleton farm, carrying the smell of wood smoke and frozen earth. Standing in the center of the gravel driveway, hands shoved deep into the pockets of his grease-stained Carhartt jacket, stood 60-year-old Arthur Pendleton. He wasn't looking at the encroaching frost. He was staring at a monster, or more accurately, the corpse of one. It was a 1974 Steiger Panther II, even broken in half, resting on heavy timber blocks, with its articulated joint severed and its front left tire missing. The tractor was terrifyingly massive. The lime-green paint was flaking away to reveal deep scabbing rust. The cab glass was completely shattered, leaving the interior exposed to the elements, and the massive 310-horsepower Cummins diesel engine sat in the chassis like a mechanical heart that had suffered a fatal coronary. "You've finally lost your mind, old man," a voice said from behind him. Arthur didn't turn. He knew the frustration in that voice intimately. It belonged to his 24-year-old son, Cody. Cody was built like his mother's side of the family, tall, lean, and highly pragmatic. He had returned to the farm after 2 years at an agricultural college, bringing with him a head full of modern ideas about computerized yields, high-interest leverage, and aggressive expansion. "She's got good bones, Cody," Arthur murmured, stepping forward to run a calloused, ungloved hand over the icy steel of the front grille. "Good bones," Cody scoffed, kicking the frozen gravel. "Dad, it's a scrap heap. I talked to the yardmaster at Miller's Salvage. He told me you gave him $1,200 for this paperweight. $1,200 that was supposed to be our seed money for the spring fertilizer." Arthur finally turned to face his son. His eyes, the color of weathered slate, were hard. "We don't buy fertilizer if we don't have a machine big enough to pull the Deep Ripper across the new bottomland. You know that." The new bottomland was the crux of the Pendleton family's current crisis. Arthur's older brother had passed away suddenly in September, leaving Arthur an additional 400 acres of heavy clay-rich soil. It was a blessing that felt like a curse. To farm it, they needed heavy horsepower. But the Pendleton farm operated on a strict, almost religious philosophy. No debt. While every other farmer in Mercer County was marching into the First National Bank of Ohio, signing their souls away on variable-rate loans to buy shiny enclosed cab John Deere and International Harvester tractors, Arthur refused. He remembered the stories his grandfather told about the bank foreclosures of the 1930s. The Pendleton farm was fully paid off. The deed sat in a fireproof box under Arthur's bed. But being debt-free meant being cash-poor. "We could just go to the bank, Dad," Cody pleaded, his breath pluming in the freezing air. "Richard Caldwell said we're pre-approved for up to $80,000. We could go to the dealership right now, buy a reliable, warranty-backed machine, and be ready for the spring thaw. Instead, you bought a tractor that threw a rot, snapped its drive shaft, and sat in a swamp for 3 years. Caldwell is a vulture in a polyester suit," Arthur shot back, his voice dropping to a gravelly growl. "You think the bank wants to help us? They want the deed, Cody. They want the land. You signed that paper, and the moment crop prices dip, and they always dip, they'll snatch the ground your grandfather cleared with his bare hands. I won't owe another man for my survival." "So our survival depends on that," Cody pointed a shaking finger at the Steiger. "Dad, the engine block is cracked. The hydraulics are shot. It's November. We have maybe 4 months before the ground thaws. We can't rebuild a commercial diesel engine in an unheated barn by ourselves." "We don't have a choice," Arthur said simply. He walked past his son, clapping a heavy hand on Cody's shoulder. "Grab the chain hoist. We need to get the block out before the snow flies." The tension between father and son was a living, breathing thing. Cody resented his father's stubbornness, viewing it as a dangerous relic of a bygone era. Arthur, in turn, feared his son had been seduced by the easy promises of modern credit. The Steiger resting in the frozen mud became the ultimate battleground for their conflicting ideologies. Word spread fast in a small farming community. By the end of the week, the Pendletons' junkyard purchase was the talk of the local diner. Henderson Agribusiness, a massive corporate farming operation that was aggressively buying up family farms in the county, found the situation particularly amusing. Warren Henderson, the CIO, even drove his brand-new Cadillac past the Pendleton driveway, slowing down just enough to roll down the window and laugh at the sight of Arthur and Cody wrestling a rusty transmission out of the mud. The pressure was mounting. If they failed to get the Steiger running, they couldn't plant the new acreage. If they didn't plant, they couldn't pay the property taxes. For the first time in his life, Arthur was gambling the farm, and the dealer was a broken pile of green steel. December arrived with a brutal, biting hostility. The temperature rarely crept above freezing, turning the uninsulated Pendleton barn into a meat locker. Inside, bathed in the harsh, flickering glow of halogen work lights, the Steiger was entirely disassembled. It looked less like a machine, and more like an autopsy. Arthur and Cody worked 18-hour days. Their hands were perpetually stained black with grease, the skin cracked and bleeding from the cold and the harsh chemical solvents. The sheer scale of the tractor made every task agonizing. Every bolt required a breaker bar. Every part required a hoist. "Hold the light steady, damn it," Arthur grunted, lying on his back on a piece of frozen cardboard beneath the massive engine block. He was trying to thread a custom-tapped bolt into the oil pan. "I am holding it steady. Your hands are shaking." Cody snapped back, shivering violently. He shone the flashlight into the gloom. "Did Bill Farnsworth find the piston rings?" "He said he'd have them by Thursday," Arthur replied, sliding out from under the chassis and wiping his forehead with a filthy rag. Bill Farnsworth ran the local agricultural parts supply in the town of Oakhaven. He was an old friend of Arthur's, but even Bill thought this was a fool's errand. When Arthur had walked into the shop requesting a rebuild kit for a 12-litre Cummins engine and a custom-machined articulation joint, Bill had just shaken his head. "Arthur, you're chasing a ghost," Bill had warned him across the counter. "Even if you get the pistons to fire the hydraulic pressure required to steer, that beast will blow every dry, rotted hose on the frame. It's scrap. Cut your losses. Sell it for weight." But Arthur refused. To fund the parts, he made a sacrifice that nearly broke Cody's heart. Arthur took his grandfather's prized Winchester, 1886 lever-action rifle, a family heirloom that had hung over the fireplace for 50 years, and sold it to a collector in Toledo. When Cody found out, the fight that erupted in the barn nearly tore them apart. "You sold great-granddad's rifle for fuel injectors," Cody had screamed, kicking over a bucket of oily water. "You're sacrificing the family history for a hunk of junk that's going to bankrupt us anyway. I'm sacrificing the past to secure your future." Arthur roared back, his chest heaving. "A gun on the wall doesn't plant corn. It doesn't pay taxes." For 3 days after that, they worked in total silence, the only sounds the clanking of wrenches and the howling of the wind outside. Slowly, painstakingly, the engine was reassembled. They had to teach themselves to hone the cylinder walls using a drill and an abrasive brush, praying their tolerances were close enough to hold compression. They spliced miles of wiring, bypassing the rotted factory harnesses with thick, heavy-duty copper wire. In the second week of January, A sleek, black Lincoln Town car pulled into the driveway. Richard Caldwell, the loan officer from First National, stepped out. He wore a heavy wool overcoat and a condescending smile. Arthur met him at the barn door, blocking the entrance. "Arthur, good to see you," Caldwell said, his breath pluming. "I was just out this way, checking on the Henderson place. They just took delivery of 3 brand-new climate-controlled tractors. Beautiful machines." "State your business, Richard. It's cold." Caldwell chuckled, peering over Arthur's shoulder at the monstrous, half-assembled Steiger in the dim light. "Just wanted to remind you that our offer still stands. Your property taxes are due in April. If this project of yours doesn't pan out, the bank is more than willing to consolidate your brother's land with your current deed under a very favorable 30-year note. It would be a shame to see you lose the family legacy over a stubborn streak." Arthur's jaw tightened. "My legacy is not for sale, and I don't owe you a dime. Get off my property." Caldwell's smile vanished. "Pride doesn't pay the bills, Arthur. When you fail, Henderson is going to buy this land for pennies on the dollar. Good day." The encounter lit a fire under Arthur. He worked through the nights, his body aching his arthritis, screaming in the cold. By January 23rd, the engine was fully assembled, married to the transmission, and bolted to the frame. They had filled it with 15 gallons of fresh oil and bled the massive fuel lines. It was time to test it. Cody climbed into the open-air cab. They hadn't been able to afford replacement glass, so the cab was just a steel cage against the elements. He turned the key. The starter whined a heavy, agonizingly slow, grinding sound. Rrrr. Nothing. "Give it more throttle," Arthur yelled from the ground. Cody pumped the pedal. He turned the key again. The starter groaned, the batteries draining fast in the cold. A puff of black smoke coughed from the vertical exhaust stack, but the engine refused to catch. "It's not getting compression, Dad," Cody said, his voice trembling with a mixture of cold and devastating defeat. "The cylinder rings aren't seating. We machined it wrong. It's dead." Arthur slumped against the massive green tire. The weight of his gamble, the loss of the heirloom rifle, the looming threat of the bank, it all crashed down on him. He closed his eyes, listening to the bitter wind rattling the barn's tin roof. Then the crackle of the old AM radio sitting on the workbench caught his attention. The local broadcaster's voice cut through the static, sounding unusually tense. "National Weather Service has issued an emergency bulletin. A massive low-pressure system moving north from the Gulf of Mexico is violently colliding with an Arctic air mass plunging down from Canada. The barometric pressure is dropping at an unprecedented rate. This is not a standard winter storm. Repeat, this is an extreme weather event. Residents are advised to shelter in place immediately." Arthur looked up. The single bare bulb hanging from the barn ceiling began to sway. "Dad," Cody said, pointing to the fuel pump. "Look." In his exhaustion, Arthur had bypassed a crucial grounding wire on the electrical shutoff solenoid. The fuel was being blocked. With trembling hands, Arthur grabbed a piece of scrap wire, stripped the ends with his teeth, and bypassed the solenoid directly to the battery. "Try it now," he barked. Cody turned the key. The starter whined once, twice, and then with a deafening, earth-shaking roar, the massive 310-horsepower Cummins diesel erupted into life. A massive plume of black soot shot from the exhaust stack, coating the barn rafters. The concrete floor vibrated. It was the loudest, most beautiful sound Arthur had ever heard. But as father and son cheered over the deafening idol of the resurrected beast, the barn doors blew violently open. A wall of blinding, pure white snow blasted into the barn. The blizzard of '78 had arrived. It didn't start like normal snow. It was a horizontal wall of pulverized ice, driven by wind gusts that screamed like a jet engine. By midnight on January 25th, the barometric pressure over Ohio had dropped to 28 inches hurricane levels. The temperature plummeted to 5 degrees below zero, but the howling 80-mile-per-hour winds pushed the wind chill down to an unfathomable -50. Inside the Pendleton farmhouse, the electricity had died hours ago. Arthur and Cody were huddled around the cast-iron wood stove in the living room, wrapped in every quilt they owned. The house groaned under the sheer force of the wind. Outside the window there was nothing but a terrifying, absolute white void. The snow wasn't just falling. It was being driven into massive, concrete-hard drifts that swallowed fences, cars, and eventually the first floors of homes. "I've never seen anything like this," Cody whispered, feeding another log into the stove. "It sounds like a freight train is parked on the roof." Arthur sat silently staring at the battery-powered CB radio on the table. The local emergency channels had been a chaotic mess of panic for the first few hours, but now they were growing ominously quiet. Suddenly, a voice broke through the static. It was faint, desperate, and broken by interference. "Anyone copying? This is Sheriff Dale Gibson. Repeat, anyone on this frequency. County plows are stranded. We have a mass casualty event developing on State Route 29. Arthur lunged for the radio, grabbing the microphone. "Sheriff, this is Arthur Pendleton. I copy you. What's your situation?" "Arthur, thank God." The sheriff's voice cracked. "It's a nightmare out here. The winds pushed a Greyhound bus off the embankment near the Henderson property. There are 3 passenger cars trapped behind it. We've got maybe 40 people out here. The bus engine died an hour ago. The heater is gone. People are freezing to death, Arthur. We can't get to them. The snow is drifting 15 feet high." "What about the county rotary plows?" Arthur demanded. "Dead. Frozen solid," Sheriff Gibson replied. "I called Henderson Agribusiness, begged them to bring out those new heavy tractors. Warren Henderson said the computerized fuel injection systems froze up and their electronics shorted in the cold. They can't even get them out of the sheds. Arthur, there's no one coming. We're going to lose these people." Arthur slowly put the microphone down. He looked at Cody. The young man's face was pale in the firelight. "The Steiger," Cody said, his voice barely a whisper. "It has no cab glass, Cody," Arthur said grimly. "Taking it out in -50 wind chill. It's a suicide mission. The cold will stop a man's heart in 20 minutes without shelter." "We parked it inside," Cody argued, standing up. "We put the block heater on it before the power went out. The engine block is still warm. It's pure mechanical injection. No computers to freeze. No delicate electronics. It's raw iron and diesel." Arthur stared at his son. In Cody's eyes, he didn't see the college kid who wanted to run to the bank. He saw his grandfather. He saw a farmer. "Get the snowmobile suits," Arthur ordered. "Get the ski goggles. Wrap your face in wool until you can barely breathe. We're going to war." 10 minutes later, looking like deep-sea divers in their massive insulated suits and goggles, they fought their way across the yard. The 60 feet from the house to the barn took them 10 minutes. The wind knocked Cody off his feet twice. The snow was up to their chests. Inside the freezing barn, the Steiger loomed in the darkness. Arthur climbed into the open-air cab, brushing snow off the vinyl seat. He prayed to God, turned the key, and hit the starter. Because the engine was purely mechanical, and because they had painstakingly rebuilt it with raw, heavy-duty tolerances, it didn't care about the computer-killing cold. The massive Cummins diesel roared to life on the first crank, spewing a defiant cloud of black exhaust into the freezing barn. "Get in!" Arthur screamed over the roar of the engine and the howling wind. Cody climbed up the side ladder, wedging himself behind his father's seat, gripping the roll cage. Arthur threw the heavy transmission into low gear. He didn't bother opening the barn doors. The snowdrift was piled halfway up the wood anyway. He dumped the clutch. The 20-ton lime-green behemoth surged forward. With a sickening crunch of splintering wood, the Steiger shattered the barn doors, exploding out into the white abyss. The impact of the cold was instantaneous and brutal. Through the shattered windows of the cab, the wind shrieked, driving ice crystals into their exposed skin like buckshot. Arthur could barely see past the tractor's massive hood. But the Steiger didn't falter. Its massive 5-foot-tall tires, chained and heavy, bit into the packed snow. They reached the end of the driveway where a 10-foot drift blocked the county road. Arthur throttled up. The engine howled the turbocharger, whistling a high-pitched scream of pure power. The tractor hit the drift, shuddered, and then pushed. The immense weight and torque of the machine simply overwhelmed the snow, tearing a massive trench through the concrete-hard drift. "We need to go 3 miles south, Toka," Cody yelled, pointing into the whiteout. Arthur nodded, wrestling with the heavy hydraulic steering. They were driving blind, navigating only by the faint outlines of the telephone poles. The cold was agonizing. Arthur couldn't feel his hands on the steering wheel, and his eyelashes were freezing together. But beneath him, the scrapyard tractor was alive. The heat radiating off the massive diesel engine block provided just enough warmth through the firewall to keep them from freezing to death in the open cab. For an hour they battled the storm. The Steiger relentlessly crushed through drifts that had swallowed cars whole. They passed the Henderson farm, where 3 pristine, brand-new $500,000 tractors sat utterly paralyzed in the snow, useless statues to modern convenience. Finally, through the blinding swirl, Cody spotted a faint, flashing red light. "There!" he screamed, pointing to the right. Arthur turned the heavy machine. Emerging from the whiteout was a horrific scene. A massive Greyhound bus was tilted at a dangerous angle, down an embankment, half buried in a drift. Behind it, barely visible under the snow, were 3 cars and Sheriff Gibson's cruiser. Arthur pulled the Steiger up to the embankment, the massive machine, idling like a rumbling volcano in the storm. He threw the parking brake and climbed down, sinking to his waist in the snow. Sheriff Gibson stumbled out of his cruiser, his face white with frostbite. When he saw the massive rusted green tractor idling in the apocalypse, he looked like a man who had just seen an angel. "Arthur," Gibson cried over the wind. "The bus doors are frozen shut. The snow is packed too high against the side. We can't get them out, and the temperature inside is dropping fast." Arthur looked at the bus, then back at the Steiger. He didn't have a plow blade. He didn't have a winch, but he had 20 tons of raw, unapologetic steel. "Cody!" Arthur screamed up to the cab. "Bring her around. We're going to use the back tire to break the drift." Cody climbed into the driver's seat. His hands were numb, his body shivering uncontrollably, but he grabbed the massive gear shift. He backed the articulated beast up, angling the massive rear wheels toward the frozen wall of snow, trapping the bus doors. "Easy," Arthur signaled with his flashlight. Cody eased the clutch out. The rear of the Steiger backed into the 15-foot drift. The sheer weight of the machine crushed the packed snow like styrofoam. He pulled forward, then slammed back again, the massive chained tire acting like a battering ram. On the third hit, the drift collapsed. Arthur and the sheriff scrambled down the embankment, ripping open the emergency release on the bus doors. Inside, 40 passengers were huddled together, crying, shivering, and losing hope. "Listen to me," Arthur bellowed into the freezing bus. "Everyone who can walk, grab someone who can't. We're getting you out of here." But as the passengers began to stumble out into the blinding storm, a new, terrifying reality set in. They had freed the people, but the Pendleton farm was 3 miles away. The sheriff's car was dead. The bus was dead. and the Steiger only had 2 seats in its open freezing cab. They couldn't transport 40 freezing people through a blizzard on a tractor. Arthur stared into the howling white void. The rescue wasn't over. It had just begun, and the cold was finally starting to win. The wind screamed across the frozen Ohio landscape with the fury of a wounded animal, drowning out the cries of the terrified passengers. The thermometer on Sheriff Dale Gibson's cruiser had shattered hours ago, but the wind chill was plunging rapidly toward -60 degrees. Inside the tilted Greyhound bus, 40 people were crammed together in total darkness. The ambient temperature inside the metal tube was dropping by the minute. Frost was already forming on the inside of the windows, and the youngest passengers were beginning to slip into the dangerous quiet lethargy that preceded deep hypothermia. Arthur Pendleton stood waist-deep in the snowdrift, shining his heavy rubberized flashlight into the panicked eyes of the survivors. He knew the brutal arithmetic of the situation. The Pendleton farm was 3 miles away through impenetrable drifts. The massive Steiger Panther II had only 2 exposed seats in its gutted cab. Walking the passengers through this whiteout was a guaranteed death sentence. The sheer force of the wind would suffocate them, packing their lungs with microscopic ice crystals before they could cover half a mile. "We can't walk them, Arthur!" Sheriff Gibson yelled, gripping the lapels of his frozen uniform jacket. His face was a ghastly shade of blue. "The old folks won't make it 100 yards, and the kids are already freezing up." Arthur turned his gaze from the bus to the 3 passenger vehicles, half buried in the snow directly behind the Greyhound, a heavy steel Ford LTD, a Chevrolet Caprice, and a rusted Dodge Dart. They were dead, their engines frozen, and batteries drained, but their metal frames were intact. "We aren't going to walk them. Dale!" Arthur bellowed over the roar of the idling Steiger. "We're going to drag them." Or Cody, who had climbed down from the tractor, looked at his father in shock. "Drag them, Dad. That's over 12,000 pounds of dead weight. The hydraulic steering is already sluggish from the cold, and the transmission fluid is practically molasses. That Cummins diesel has 310 horses and enough torque to pull a house off its foundation." Arthur replied, his voice hard as flint. "Open the toolboxes on the tractor. Get the heavy logging chains, all of them." For the next 20 agonizing minutes, Arthur Cody and the sheriff worked frantically in the blinding whiteout. They used the massive heavy-duty steel chains that Arthur had scavenged from Miller's salvage. They linked the heavy steel frame of the Ford LTD directly to the Steiger's rear drawbar. From the Ford, they ran a chain to the front axle of the Chevrolet Caprice and finally connected the Dodge Dart to the rear. It was a makeshift, desperate train of frozen metal. "Listen to me," Sheriff Gibson shouted into the bus, holding his flashlight up to illuminate the shivering crowd. "I need everyone to move. We are going to cram into those 3 cars. It is going to be incredibly tight, but your shared body heat is the only thing that will keep you alive in those cabins. Move." The evacuation was chaotic and terrifying. Mothers clutched their crying children. Elderly men, leaning on canes, stumbled through the knee-high snow, guided by Arthur's strong, frostbitten hands. They packed 14 people into the Ford LTD, 13 into the Caprice, and 13, including the sheriff, into the Dodge Dart. They were pressed against the glass, stacked on floorboards, and sitting on each other's laps. It was claustrophobic, but almost instantly, the collective heat of 40 bodies began to slightly raise the temperature inside the cramped, unheated vehicles. Arthur and Cody climbed back up the icy ladder, into the open-air cage of the Steiger's cab. The wind immediately assaulted them, tearing at their heavy canvas coats. Arthur took the wheel, his joints screaming in agony as he shoved the heavy transmission into its lowest, most powerful gear. "Brace yourself," Arthur yelled to Cody over the deafening clatter of the diesel engine. Arthur slowly eased his foot off the heavy clutch. The massive lime-green tractor shuddered violently, The heavy lugged tires spun for a fraction of a second, throwing massive rooster tails of packed snow high into the air, before they finally bit into the frozen earth beneath the drifts. The heavy steel logging chain snapped taut with a sickening clack that echoed over the howling wind. For a terrifying second, nothing happened. The Steiger groaned its massive frame, twisting against the severed articulation joint they had painstakingly rebuilt by hand in the barn. The engine RPMs dropped precipitously. The turbocharger whined a desperate, high-pitched scream. Black smoke poured from the vertical exhaust stack in thick, choking clouds. "She can't pull it!" Cody screamed, watching the exhaust. "The dead weight is too much." "Come on, you ugly bastard!" Arthur roared, slamming his foot down on the throttle. "Pull!" With a metallic groan that sounded like a dying beast, the Steiger surged forward. The Ford LTD violently jerked out of its icy tomb. A second later, the Caprice was ripped from the drift, followed by the Dodge Dart. The iron train was moving. They crawled forward at a grueling pace of 3 miles per hour. The journey back to the Pendleton farm was a nightmare of endurance. Every massive drift they hit acted like a brick wall. The tractor would slam into the packed snow, the front end rearing up slightly under the immense torque, before crushing the obstacle and dragging the 3 heavy cars through the newly created trench. Inside the open cab, Arthur and Cody were losing their battle against the elements. The -50-degree wind chill was penetrating their layers. Arthur's hands, gripping the freezing steel of the steering wheel, had lost all feeling 20 minutes ago. His vision was blurring his eyelashes, frozen completely shut. Cody stood behind him, acting as his father's eyes, constantly shouting directions to keep them on the invisible road. Disaster struck at the 2-mile mark. They hit a massive 10-foot-tall drift that had completely swallowed a fallen oak tree. The Steiger's massive front tires climbed the hidden trunk, bouncing the 20-ton machine violently. The sudden shockwave traveled down the drawbar. Bang! The sound was louder than a gunshot. The Steiger suddenly lurched forward, entirely freed of its massive load. "Stop!" Cody shrieked, grabbing his father's shoulder. The chain snapped. Arthur slammed on the heavy air brakes, bringing the tractor to a sliding halt. He threw the transmission into neutral and practically fell out of the cab, his frozen legs failing him as he hit the ground. He waded back through the waist-deep powder to the front of the Ford LTD. The heavy logging chain had snapped cleanly in half at a weakened link. The iron was so thoroughly frozen that the sheer kinetic shock had shattered it like glass. "We need the spare shackle," Arthur yelled up to Cody, his voice hoarse and broken. Cody threw down a heavy steel U-shackle from the toolbox. Arthur grabbed it, but his thick, insulated gloves were too bulky to thread the heavy steel pin through the broken links of the chain. Without a second thought, Arthur ripped off his right glove. The moment his bare flesh touched the freezing ambient air, it felt like his hand had been plunged into boiling water. The cold was so absolute it burned. He grabbed the heavy steel chain. The moisture on his bare palm instantly froze, bonding his skin to the frozen metal. Ignoring the searing agony, Arthur threaded the massive pin through the links and twisted the bolt tight. When he pulled his hand away, a layer of his skin remained frozen to the chain. Arthur didn't scream. He simply shoved his bleeding, frost-bitten hand back into his glove, gave a thumbs up to the terrified passengers watching him through the frosted glass of the Ford, and dragged himself back up to the cab. "Drive!" Arthur gasped, collapsing into the passenger side of the roll cage. "I can't feel my arms. You have to drive." Cody slid into the heavy driver's seat. He grabbed the gear shift, dumped the clutch, and brought the massive machine back under tension. For the final mile, Cody fought the steering wheel like a man possessed, his tears freezing to his cheeks as he watched his father slowly drifting into unconsciousness beside him. Finally, through the blinding white wall of the storm, the dark silhouette of the Pendleton farmhouse emerged. Cody drove the tractor straight up to the front porch, the 3 dragged cars sliding into the yard behind him. He laid on the heavy air horn, a continuous, deafening blast that signaled their survival. They had made it. The next 48 hours were a blur of fire and survival. Cody and Sheriff Gibson dragged the freezing passengers into the farmhouse. They packed the massive stone fireplace with every piece of dry wood they possessed, eventually breaking down the dining room chairs to keep the flames roaring. The 40 survivors huddled together on the living room floor, wrapped in every blanket rug and coat the Pendletons owned. Arthur lay on the sofa, shivering violently, as Cody carefully tended to his father's mangled, frostbitten hand. The old man was feverish and exhausted, but every time he opened his eyes and saw the crowded room full of breathing, living people, a faint smile crossed his cracked lips. By the morning of January 28th, the storm finally broke. The howling winds died down, leaving behind an eerie, absolute silence. The Ohio landscape was unrecognizable. Drifts 20 feet high buried houses to their roofs. Power lines were snapped like twigs, but the sky above was a brilliant, piercing blue. That afternoon, the heavy, rhythmic thumping of rotor blades echoed over the farm. A massive Ohio National Guard Huey helicopter touched down in the middle of the Pendletons' snow-covered pasture. Medics rushed the house, evacuating the elderly and the severely frostbitten first. When they tried to load Arthur onto a stretcher, the stubborn farmer simply shook his head, leaning heavily on Cody's shoulder. "I'm not leaving my farm," Arthur rasped, wrapping his bandaged hand tightly in his coat. "The job is done here." The story of the massive rusted scrapyard tractor that defeated the blizzard of '78 spread like wildfire. Local newspapers ran front-page photos of the lime green Steiger, still chained to the 3 passenger cars in the Pendleton yard, looking like a battle-scarred war hero. But while the county celebrated the cold, hard reality of the Pendletons' financial situation, remained frozen in place. Months passed. The brutal winter eventually surrendered to a wet, muddy March. The massive snowdrifts melted, turning the fields into impassable bogs. It was time to plant the new bottomland, but the Pendletons had no money for seed or fertilizer. Their entire savings had gone into the engine parts for the Steiger, and Arthur's medical bills for his severe frostbite had drained whatever tiny reserve they had left. On a crisp Tuesday morning in early April, the familiar black Lincoln Town car slowly navigated the muddy driveway. Richard Caldwell, looking as crisp and arrogant as ever, stepped out, carefully avoiding the puddles. Standing beside him was Warren Henderson, the corporate farm CEO, wearing a smug, predatory grin. Arthur and Cody were in the yard, greasing the massive articulation joints on the Steiger. Arthur's right hand was heavily scarred, 2 fingers permanently stiff from the tissue damage, but he still held a grease gun with undeniable authority. "Morning, Arthur," Caldwell said, opening a sleek leather briefcase. "I see you survived the winter. Unfortunately, survival doesn't pay the county assessor. Your property taxes are due at the end of the week. $5,000. I assume, given your lack of seed delivery, you don't have it." Henderson stepped forward, pulling a folded contract from his coat. "We can make this easy, Pendleton. I'm prepared to offer you fair market value for the 400 acres of bottomland. Caldwell here will restructure your remaining debt. You get to keep the farmhouse. You get to retire." Arthur wiped his greasy hand on a rag, staring at the 2 men with absolute disgust. "I told you both before. The land isn't for sale, and I have until Friday to pay the county." "You're a fool, Arthur," Henderson sneered. "No one is going to loan you a dime. You're entirely out of options." Before Arthur could reply, a sleek, dark blue, government-issued sedan turned into the driveway, its tires crunching heavily on the gravel. The vehicle pulled to a halt right next to Caldwell's Lincoln. The door opened, and a tall, silver-haired man in a sharply tailored charcoal suit stepped out. Arthur immediately recognized him. It was Thomas Wainwright, one of the men who had been huddled in the back of the Ford LTD during the blinding rescue. He had sat quietly by the fire for 2 days, helping feed the children, never asking for anything. "Mr. Pendleton," Wainwright said, warmly, extending a hand. "It's wonderful to see you on your feet." "Mr. Wainwright," Arthur replied, shaking his hand firmly. "What brings you all the way out here?" Caldwell scoffed, stepping forward. "Excuse me, we are in the middle of a private financial negotiation here." Wainwright turned his gaze to the banker, his eyes narrowing. "I know exactly who you are, Mr. Caldwell. I am the director of the Ohio Emergency Management Agency, and I can assure you the Pendletons' financial negotiations are concluded." Wainwright turned back to Arthur and Cody, pulling a heavy official-looking envelope from his jacket. "Arthur, the state of Ohio has a discretionary fund for extraordinary acts of civilian heroism during state emergencies. You saved 40 lives that night, my life included. The state legislature unanimously voted to award you the maximum Civilian Emergency Services grant." He handed the envelope to Arthur. Cody leaned over his father's shoulder, his eyes going wide as he saw the figure printed on the official state check. It was $50,000. Furthermore, Wainwright continued, a slight smile playing on his lips, "the passengers of that bus took up a private collection. We know you sacrificed your family heirloom to buy parts for this magnificent machine. We couldn't find the exact rifle, but we managed to track down a pristine 1886 Winchester. It's in the trunk of my car." Caldwell's face went pale. Henderson looked as though he had just swallowed a lemon. Without a word, the 2 men turned, climbed into the Lincoln, and sped quickly out of the driveway, their predatory dreams completely shattered. Arthur stood perfectly still, clutching the envelope in his scarred hand. He looked at Cody, the tension of the past 6 months finally melting away from his weathered face. They didn't just have enough for the taxes. They had enough for the best fertilizer in the county, enough to build a proper heated barn, and enough to keep the Pendleton legacy alive and debt-free for another generation. Arthur slowly turned around, walking over to the massive rusted lime-green tractor. He placed his hand on the cold steel of the front grille, feeling the history and the raw power locked inside the iron. "Fire her up, Cody," Arthur said, a deep, resonant laugh escaping his chest. "We've got bottomland to plow. If you found yourself holding your breath during Arthur and Cody's incredible fight for survival against the blizzard of '78, hit that like button. This true testament to grit, mechanical ingenuity, and the unbreakable spirit of the American farmer deserves to be heard. Share this video with someone who loves a legendary comeback story, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more thrilling real-life tales from the heartland. Drop a comment below with your favorite moment.